September 15, 1944. Peleliu, Palau Islands. The sun hung low over the shattered coral ridges of Peleliu, turning the broken landscape into a blinding sheet of white fire. Heat shimmered above the rocks like a living thing, bending the air, making it difficult for any man to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. Amid that merciless glare, a single Marine dragged a machine gun across terrain that looked more like the surface of a dead planet than a Pacific island. His boots sank into powdered coral. Every step felt heavier than the last, and every movement stirred the silence that clung to the jungle with unnatural stillness. Private Walter Briggs, 22 years old and thousands of miles from Ohio, carried the Browning M1917 machine gun with a grim determination. The weapon, nicknamed the Too Heavy Gun, weighed close to 100 pounds when fully assembled with its water-cooling jacket, tripod, and ammunition belt. Most Marines avoided it. Some cursed its existence. Others swore they would rather face a Japanese bayonet charge than haul that monster across Peleliu's ridges. But Briggs had volunteered to carry it after the previous gunner was killed during a night patrol, and he had done so without hesitation. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Every like, every share, every comment helps us honor those who lived these moments and shows your support for the hard work that goes into bringing these forgotten stories back to life. So hit that subscribe button, join our community, and tell us where you're watching from. Together, we're not just remembering history, we're keeping it alive. He never spoke the real reason out loud, but he carried it inside him the way another man might carry a photograph or a prayer. The last letter from home had brought news he was not prepared for. His younger brother, barely old enough to shave, had enlisted straight into the war. That letter had shaken Briggs more deeply than any grenade blast. It reminded him that the war was tightening its grip around his family. He carried the Too Heavy Gun not for glory, not for medals, but for survival. His and his brother's. As long as he kept moving forward, he believed there was still a chance they might both live long enough to see each other again. Through the shimmering haze, the coral ridge ahead loomed like a jagged set of teeth. Earlier that morning, the Marines' advance had stalled there. Scout reports had confirmed the worst. At least 60 Japanese soldiers were dug into those cliffs. Hidden bunkers woven into the rock, machine gun nests buried under camouflage, snipers tucked behind crevices invisible from ground level. 2 platoons had already been torn apart trying to force their way past that ridge. Men whispered that the rocks themselves seemed to spit bullets. Command expected heavy casualties. Some doubted anyone would make it across. But Walter Briggs saw something that no scout had reported and no officer had noticed. Halfway up the ridge, barely visible under the shadow of an overhanging slab of coral, lay a small outcropping, a natural platform carved by time and weather. From that ledge, a single gunner could see nearly the entire Japanese defensive network. Dozens of Marines had died trying to reach it. Dozens more would die if someone didn't break the stalemate. Briggs understood the risk, but he also understood the opportunity. That outcropping could change everything, if he could reach it. The ground between him and that position, however, was open. No cover, no trees, no craters deep enough to hide in. Just 50 yards of blistering white coral that reflected the sun into the eyes of anyone foolish enough to crawl across it. Every Marine knew the Japanese were masters of patience. They would let a man crawl for minutes, even hours, just to kill him once he reached the exact spot they wanted him to die. Yet Briggs went anyway. He lowered himself against the scorching ground, feeling the sting of sharp coral against his elbows and knees. Sweat rolled down his face, dripping onto the metal body of the machine gun as he began inching forward. The air smelled of dust, blood, and the faint metallic tang of spent ammunition. Each movement sent small clouds of powdered coral drifting upward, and the silence of the ridge pressed down harder with every foot of ground he gained. 15 yards, 20, 25. Still no shots fired. That alone was enough to raise every alarm in his mind. The Japanese never missed opportunities like this. If a Marine exposed himself in the open, they would rain fire until his body stopped moving. Briggs kept crawling, listening to his own breath, listening to the heartbeat thudding in his head. The heavy gun felt like it was dragging him backward, trying to pull him into the earth. But he pushed on. 30 yards, 35, 40. Still nothing. Still no muzzle flashes. Still no sniper crack. Only the unsettling impression that many eyes, were watching him from unseen places. That was the moment Briggs realized the truth. They weren't shooting at him because they wanted him closer. He wasn't slipping past their defenses. He wasn't surprising anyone. He was being allowed to advance. He was being guided, funneled toward a specific point on the ridge. The silence wasn't mercy. It was strategy. He felt his stomach tighten as the understanding settled in. The Japanese wanted the heavy gun exactly where they could destroy it and counterattack downhill. They had lured 2 platoons into that same trap earlier in the day. Briggs was now following the same deadly path willingly. But turning back wasn't an option. He was too far in the open. He would die either way. The only chance he had was to reach the outcropping first. He crawled the final 10 yards in absolute silence, every muscle trembling from fear and exhaustion. When he finally reached the ledge, he pulled himself onto the platform and lay still, listening. The jungle offered no comfort. No birds, no insects, no breeze, just the crushing pressure of unseen watchers waiting for him to move. Then his eyes caught something that froze him where he lay. Against the rock wall, under a thin cover of brush, sat an abandoned Japanese machine gun nest. Sandbags were still intact. The gun emplacement was positioned perfectly, aimed straight into the heart of the ridge below. It was a vantage point that could dominate the battlefield. The scouts had never seen it, but someone had been here recently. Someone had eaten here. Someone had left supplies behind. Even more unnerving, someone had left in a hurry. The realization struck him with cold clarity. Whoever operated this nest could still be nearby. He scanned the shadows of a narrow cave mouth behind the sandbags. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But the sense of being observed, it didn't fade. It grew stronger. Someone had been here. Someone had watched him crawl. Someone still lingered in the ridge's darkness. He couldn't see them, but they were there. He could feel it. And at that moment, with the heavy gun finally in place, the real battle was only seconds away. The outcropping felt like a fragile island suspended above a sea of death. Walter Briggs adjusted his weight slowly, careful not to dislodge the sandbags or the thin brush that offered the illusion of cover. Every motion echoed in his mind with the fear that it might finally draw fire. But still the ridge remained eerily silent. He steadied his breath, wiped sweat from his brow, and forced himself to look over the edge. Below him, the landscape unfolded with chilling clarity. The Japanese defensive line stretched across the ridge like a series of hidden jaws. Camouflaged bunkers blended into the coral. Narrow firing slits carved into the rock seemed to stare directly at him. Tunnels disappeared into darkness. From above, the entire network resembled a vast, coiled creature waiting for the right moment to strike. It became obvious why 2 platoons had failed earlier. The ridge had been sculpted into a perfect kill zone. Yet here he was, one man with a machine gun, perched on a piece of rock the defenders had not expected anyone to reach. Briggs positioned the Browning M1917 atop the sandbags. The water-cooled weapon sat heavy and unyielding, its metal hot from the journey across the ridge. He pressed his hand against the jacket, feeling the warmth pulsing under the steel. The canteen he carried would not be enough to cool it during sustained fire, but he knew he would not have the luxury of time. If the Japanese realized what he had done, they would respond with overwhelming force. He had a narrow window, maybe a few seconds, to make the first move count. He slid the ammunition belt into place. The jungle responded with stillness so complete it felt unnatural. No birds, no breathing, no wind. Only the muted thump of distant artillery and the faint rattle of gunfire miles away. Here, on the ridge, time felt suspended. He scanned the tunnels below. Shadows shifted inside one of the openings. A glint of metal flashed behind another. Then, faint but unmistakable, he heard footsteps. Slow, measured, confident. Someone was approaching the abandoned Japanese gun position. Someone who had likely watched him crawl across the open coral. Someone who believed They had trapped him. Briggs raised his head, staring into the cave mouth behind him. Darkness swallowed everything. The presence he felt earlier pressed against the back of his neck. A chill ran through him. The Japanese rarely abandoned functioning gun positions. The fact that this one stood empty meant one of two things. Either its former operator had been killed and dragged away, or they were still nearby, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He reached for the charging handle of the Browning. Then a sound shattered the silence. The sharp metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. It came not from below, but from somewhere deep inside the cave behind him. For an instant Briggs froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He imagined the cold steel of a Japanese rifle aiming between his shoulder blades. He pictured the gunner who had fled, the watcher who had silently tracked his movements. He considered the possibility that stepping onto this ledge had placed him directly into the crosshairs of an unseen enemy whose patience far exceeded his own. But no shot came. The presence retreated into the darkness as if satisfied to watch instead of kill. The ridge below erupted in movement. Japanese soldiers stepped from tunnels like shadows turning into flesh. Officers barked orders. Riflemen sprinted to firing positions. Machine gunners scrambled to drag equipment into place. The coordinated chaos of a rapid response defense unfolded with grim efficiency. They had seen him. They had realized what he had done. He braced the too heavy gun against the sandbags. Adrenaline surged through him. His hand shook not from fear alone, but from the weight of knowing that this moment, this impossible suicidal stand, was the only chance the Marines at the base of the ridge had. If he failed, the Japanese would swarm down the slope and crush everything in front of him. A Japanese officer stepped into the open. His voice cut across the ridge like a blade, issuing commands with brutal precision. Dozens of soldiers shifted in response, forming a line that curved around the base of the ridge. Briggs could see the first hints of a flanking movement beginning to take shape. They intended to surround him. They intended to kill him from multiple angles. They intended to reclaim their position before he could fire a single sustained burst. His grip tightened. He waited. He aimed. Then, as if driven by a single unseen signal, the Japanese began to charge uphill. Briggs pulled the trigger. The too heavy gun roared to life, kicking against the sandbags with a force that shook the entire outcropping. Tracers streaked across the ridge like burning threads. The first line of charging soldiers collapsed instantly. Those behind them faltered, stumbling over the fallen. More tunnel openings vomited fighters into the sunlit clearing. The ridge transformed into an erupting battlefield. He kept the gun sweeping left to right, targeting every movement. The Browning spat brass casings that tinkled and hissed as they hit the hot coral. Smoke leaked from the water jacket. Sweat burned his eyes. He fired in disciplined bursts, counting seconds in his head, trying to prevent the weapon from overheating too quickly. But the Japanese were relentless. They surged uphill in waves, driven by desperation or duty or sheer refusal to yield. Grenades arced through the air. Rifle shots cracked against the rocks around him. Snipers hunted for the smallest gap in the sandbags. Still, he held his position. Still, he fired. Still, he refused to surrender the high ground. Below him, the bodies of soldiers began to litter the ridge. Above him, the shadow in the cave remained motionless, neither attacking nor retreating, as though waiting for a moment yet to come. Briggs grabbed his canteen and poured water into the machine gun's jacket. Steam blasted upward, stinging his face. The weapon shook violently under the strain. The enemy continued to pour from hidden tunnels, and the ridge's narrow pathways echoed with the screams of wounded men. He barely noticed the cuts on his arms from coral shards. He barely registered the heat burning through his uniform. His world had narrowed to the recoil of the too heavy gun and the unending rhythm of fire and reload, fire and reload, fire and reload. He fought like a man who knew that stepping back even an inch meant death. The ground trembled from a coordinated charge of more than 20 soldiers advancing at once. Their voices rose in a fierce yell, echoing off the cliffs. Briggs swung the gun toward them and opened fire again, the Browning chewing through the belt with mechanical fury. The charge disintegrated. Smoke choked the air. Bodies fell. Still, some kept coming. He did not stop. He could not stop. Somewhere behind him inside the cave, something shifted again. A soft footstep, a low exhale. But Briggs could no longer spare the strength to look. The two heavy gun continued tearing apart the ridge's defenders, and with every passing second, the sound grew louder, harsher, more desperate. Briggs felt the weapon vibrating, as though trying to rip itself free from his hands. His arms ached, his shoulders throbbed, his breathing came in ragged gasps. But the Japanese advance began to falter. One cluster of soldiers broke and ran. Another hesitated, unsure whether to retreat or attack. Officers yelled for them to regroup, but chaos had already taken hold. Briggs' fire had shattered their timing. Their formations collapsed. Their charge dissolved. Then, slowly, the ridge fell silent once more. This time, it was not the silence of a trap. It was the silence of fear. The first wave had failed. The second wave had failed. The planned counterattack lay in ruins. And yet Briggs remained standing, alone, exhausted, surrounded by the bodies of more than 60 men. But as the smoke cleared and the dust settled, he turned toward the cave at last. The watcher was gone. Only fresh footprints remained. They trailed deeper into the darkness of the ridge, disappearing behind a curtain of rock. Someone had survived. Someone had watched. Someone had fled. And someone would return. Smoke drifted across the ridge in thin gray sheets, carried by a faint breeze that finally began to stir after hours of suffocating stillness. The two heavy guns sat silent now, its barrel glowing faintly, its water jacket nearly empty, its metal body radiating the heat of 15 relentless minutes of fire. Walter Briggs leaned against the sandbags, chest rising and falling in deep, uneven breaths. His arms trembled from exhaustion. His hands were raw. He could feel the bruises forming beneath his uniform where the recoil had pounded into him again and again. Below him, the battlefield sprawled in a grim tableau. The bodies of fallen soldiers lay scattered across the coral ridge, unmoving in the harsh afternoon light. Grenade fragments glistened among the rocks. Empty rifles lay where they had fallen. The Japanese charge had broken like a wave against a cliff, and the silence that followed seemed almost unreal. It was as though the island itself had paused to acknowledge what had happened. But Briggs knew the ridge was not yet secure. He pushed himself upright, forcing his aching muscles to cooperate. The two heavy gun had done its job. Now he had to do his. He scanned the tunnels, searching for any movement. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then a shift of shadow caught his eye. A shape moved deep inside one of the cave openings, too far to identify, too deliberate to be an animal. There was someone alive inside that ridge, someone who had watched the entire fight unfold, someone who had not taken a shot at him, not even once. The footprints behind him were the first proof. Now, this faint movement in the cave was the second. The watcher had survived. Briggs stepped toward the cave mouth, pausing at the edge of the shadow. The heat of the battlefield faded behind him. Inside, the air grew cool and still. The ground sloped downward into darkness. The tunnel walls were rough and uneven, carved by hand and shaped by years of occupation. The air smelled of damp earth and stale smoke. He listened, straining to hear footsteps, but the cave swallowed sound like a hungry mouth. He stepped back into the sunlight. He could not enter alone. He could not afford to abandon the two heavy gun. He did not know how many more soldiers remained inside the ridge. What he did know was this: someone had left footprints that pointed away from the gun position and deeper into the cave. Someone had observed him, judged him, and left. Whether it was to report to a higher officer or to regroup for another attack, he could not tell. But the watcher existed, and that truth weighed heavier than the machine gun on his shoulders. Briggs scanned the ridge again. In the distance, the Marines from his company were beginning to advance. Figures moved cautiously among the rocks, rifles raised, checking for survivors and clearing tunnel entrances. He raised a hand and signaled to them, though he doubted they could see him from so far below. He turned back to the battlefield once more. The two heavy gun had done what no one expected. It had broken a fortified Japanese counterattack. It had stalled the defenders long enough for the Marines to regroup. It had given the American line a chance to push forward and reclaim ground thought impossible to take. And yet, for all its power, it was the silence afterward that weighed the heaviest. Briggs knelt beside the machine gun and examined the barrel. The metal shimmered from heat. The belt still lay partially fed into the chamber. A few links of ammunition dangled lifelessly from the box. He touched the jacket, feeling the warmth radiating into his palm. The gun had nearly overheated. Had he fired even a few more minutes, it might have seized. It might have jammed at the worst possible moment. It might have left him defenseless on the ridge. But it hadn't. He lifted his head, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped toward the sea. A strange feeling washed over him. The feeling that he had survived not only through skill, but through a chain of events too precise to be explained by chance. The abandoned Japanese position, the silence on the battlefield, the watcher who chose not to shoot, the footprints that vanished into the cave. Each detail formed a pattern that eluded easy explanation. He looked again at the cave entrance. The footprints had been fresh, deep, carefully placed. Whoever left them had not panicked. They had moved with intention. Briggs did not know whether they had watched out of respect, curiosity, or calculation. He did not know whether the watcher had planned to return. But something inside him whispered that the story on this ridge was not over. He sat beside the machine gun, letting the quiet settle around him like a second skin. In the distance, the sound of Marine voices echoed up the slope. Boots crushed coral as the first wave of American reinforcements approached the outcropping. They froze when they saw him. One man perched above a field of fallen soldiers, a machine gun steaming beside him like a living beast that had just finished feeding. They asked him if he needed a medic. He said he did not. They asked if he was alone. He nodded. They asked what happened. He simply pointed to the ridge. The officers who followed were silent as they surveyed the scene. No one spoke for a long time. Even the seasoned Marines, hardened by months of combat, seemed unsettled by the scale of destruction. They moved slowly, checking bodies, examining the tunnels, assessing the tactical layout of the ridge. One lieutenant asked Briggs how long the fight had lasted. Briggs looked at the sun. He wasn't sure, but the clock on his wrist told him the truth. 15 minutes. 15 minutes that had changed the entire ridge. 15 minutes that had saved lives. 15 minutes that had turned a lone outcropping into a decisive stronghold. Yet even as the officers praised his actions, Briggs' attention drifted back to the cave. He quietly mentioned the footprints, the watcher, the movement he had seen after the battle. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Japanese soldiers sometimes retreated into tunnels and hid for hours, even days, waiting for the perfect moment to counterattack. But this case felt different. Too deliberate, too symbolic. Deep inside the cave, beneath layers of rock and shadow, the watcher remained unaccounted for. When the Marines later cleared the first few meters of the tunnel, they found no footprints, only scuff marks and disturbed dust. The deeper sections were too narrow to explore safely. Engineers planned to return later with explosives and sealing equipment. The cave would be collapsed like many others on Peleliu. But the watcher's trail vanished into the earth long before they reached those depths. As dusk settled over the ridge, Briggs watched the sea grow dark. He thought of Ohio. He thought of his brother. He thought of the letter that had driven him to carry the too-heavy gun in the first place. He wondered if the watcher had also carried a burden, a reason, a story that would never be told. He did not know the answer. He never would. But the mystery stayed with him long after the sun dipped below the horizon. It remained with him through the rest of the Peleliu campaign. It remained with him when he returned home, thin and exhausted, but alive. It remained with him in the quiet years after the war, when the memories resurfaced without warning. And it remained with him when he learned, decades later, that a Japanese soldier's diary had been recovered from a collapsed tunnel near the ridge. One passage caught his attention. It spoke of an American who had seized the abandoned machine gun position with unnatural determination. It described the gunner as a man chosen by fate, someone who had appeared where no American was expected to be. The entry ended with a final sentence that chilled him. The boy with the heavy gun fought alone, but he was never alone. I watched him until he could no longer be defeated. The diary never revealed the watcher's name. It never explained why they didn't take the shot. It never revealed their fate, but it confirmed what Briggs felt all along. Someone had been there. Someone had seen. Someone had chosen silence. And that silence changed the fate of the ridge. As the years passed, Briggs seldom spoke about Peleliu. He never sought recognition. He never boasted about his actions. He often said that he survived those 15 minutes because he refused to give in to fear. But deep inside, he knew the truth was more complicated. The ridge had been a place where lives intertwined, where enemies observed one another beyond the smoke and gunfire, and where fate played its quiet hand in ways no man could fully understand. He lived long enough to see his brother return safely. He lived long enough to feel the weight of the war lift from his shoulders. He lived long enough to reflect on the ridge, the machine gun, and the unseen presence in the cave. But he never forgot the footprints, nor the strange silence in the cave, nor the single, unspoken choice that might have saved his life without him ever knowing why. And as the war faded into history, one truth remained. On a blistering ridge in Peleliu, a lone Marine with a heavy gun had carved his name into the legacy of forgotten soldiers, not through glory, but through will, grit, and the invisible threads that connect destinies in the chaos of battle. When the story of the ridge was retold by those who survived, it carried a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, the line between enemy and observer could blur in unexpected ways. That courage often emerges when least expected, and that every battlefield holds secrets only the dead can truly explain. As the narrator's voice softens, the memory of the ridge lingers. If stories like this remind you that courage still matters, that forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, then share the story with someone who loves history. Like the video, leave a comment telling where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends for more powerful stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the mysteries left behind by war. Your support keeps these legs and alive.